Well, our special guest this hour is Democratic Representative from Ohio, Dennis Kucinich, and if he will thankfully be here later to take your questions as well. But right now, we welcome him. Thank you so much for being with us. I have to ask you first, you sent this great letter to the new SEC chair, Mary Shapiro, in regard to the Robert Stanford $8 billion fraud, basically saying the SEC has been remiss all along.
Well, the SEC was prepared in 2006, in October, to move on Stanford and the Stanford Group. But according to a report in the New York Times, the SEC stood down at the request of an unnamed government agency. I want to know, as chairman of Domestic Policy Subcommittee, who told the Securities and Exchange Commission not to move on the Stanford Group back in October of 2006 and put at risk all these investors all around the world, and we need to know who was behind it. So I, as part of the process of beginning an inquiry, sent a letter to the SEC to try to get some answers.
And the SEC has been under fire lately between the Bernie Madoff scandal, claiming that they've known for 10 years now that something like this was going on.
And we found out this past week that Bernie Madoff hadn't invested $1 for people over a 13-year period. Congressman, to that point, you've been in Congress since 1996. Where were the lawmakers overseeing these entities and these regulators?
Well, first of all, you have to look at how regulatory structures are set up. You have the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is supposed to be keeping an eye on these securities, and they didn't do it. When they started to take action, for whatever reason, they were told not to. Then you have the internal regulation of the finance industry, a group called FINRA. They were very weak in their regulation. Then you have the Federal Reserve, which is supposed to keep an eye on the banks. They've been lax. And then, of course, at the next level, you have the Congress of the United States. The fact of the matter is that investors all over the world, and particularly in the United States, have plenty of reasons to be skeptical about the liquidity of our financial system.
Right, because the question
and about the safety of their investments.
Sure, because at this point, everyone's questioning who's watching out for me. If not the SEC, then who? So then I guess the big question is, how do we change this going forward? How do we prevent these mishaps from happening again?
Well, I think, obviously we're moving to an era where questions are being asked. But just think of what would have happened if back a few years ago, people started to ask questions about these black box financing strategies, the opaqueness of what Madoff was up to in Stanford. If the questions would have been asked then a lot of investors would have been spared a lot of heartache. Now we're in a situation where the questions have to be asked. I'm chairman of Domestic Policy Subcommittee. We're going to ask the questions and get answers why, and hopefully that will be part of a process that imposes some discipline on these investment schemes.
What about, really quickly, Congressman, what about greater fines? I'm looking at the Robert Allen Stanford case. He was fined $20,000 back in 2007 by the SEC for violating broker-dealer capital requirements, $10,000 from FINRA, which is the self-regulator. Do we need to have heftier penalties?
Well, it goes beyond that. I mean, if people cannot be on the up and up, they just have to be stripped of their license and their ability to transact business. The government has a responsibility to protect investors. Now, caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, is always a good principle. But the people have a right to expect that the government is going to be sorting out any shady dealers, and that apparently has not been done.
Congressman, stay right there. You're going to be with us for the entire hour.